Absolute Martian Manhunter is back in DC Comics. It was far and away one of the best comic book titles going in the entire comic book industry, and now that it's here, it's the talk of the town. So, what this does is, of course, with issue number 7, picks up after issue number 6, but some time has passed, and you're actually going to see over the course of this, a good chunk of time has passed, and a lot of things have changed. So what this does here is this initially opens up with John Jones, right? He says, Bridget, Tyler, right, his wife and his child, I didn't think that you would be here. And Bridget just kind of asked the question, right? Why wouldn't we be here? This is our home, isn't it? And John asks, right? I don't know. There was a fight, wasn't there? And she just tells him, forget it, John. It was all in your head. And that's when the Martian pops up and says, sorry, partner, it's time to wake up. And that's when Bridget says, but what happens in your head also happens. And John wakes up in an apartment, a pretty shoddy apartment, by himself. Now, that's kind of the cool thing, because for those of you guys who didn't see the first 6 issues or didn't follow it very closely, the Absolute Martian Manhunter still doesn't really have a definitive origin. We'll learn a bit of it over the course of this comic, but by and large, it's just John Jones who was suddenly hit with the Martian Manhunter as we know him. And between the two of them working together, they were able to defeat the White Martian, which again, we'll also talk about. But that's why you get these comic book panels where it looks like John Jones, but it's actually the Manhunter, because they're effectively one and the same. He's possessed by the Manhunter. Now, the other part of this is that it picks up at what's called the Starlight Hotel, and John muses to himself. He says, I am not human until I have my first one of the day. I'm not myself, of course, referring to a cigarette. And that's where the Martian just says, self equals beautiful illusion. Martian vision sees past self. World, illusion. And so again, white lies versus rationalizations. White lies are lies that we tell people to make them feel good. Rationalizations are lies we tell ourselves to make ourselves feel good. And people do this quite a bit, because what John says is that it's true. There are no illusions here at the Starlight Motel. What you see is exactly what you get. And so the Martian says, fog of long hauls, body odor, divorce. This is a pretty run-down, shady spot. And so John says, except for the fake plants and the fake names and the fake lovers. And he says, an in-between place for in-between people. But it's cheap, and it's only temporary. And that's where the Manhunter says things like death by ecstasy, lowest equals highest. Only temporary, life in short. It's the very definition of what it means to be human. Life is temporary. And so these guys all kind of represent this sort of literal definition of what it means to live, a temporary period in time. And so that's what the Martian says, must talk, communicate, connect, John. Recent cosmic trauma threatens soul, sanity, humanity. Without treatment, complete self-destruction assured. Now, this can be interpreted in a couple of different ways, but a lot of it seems to be, John, you need to talk to someone, right? You need to get yourself sorted out, because lest we forget, Middleton experienced this huge surreal event for pretty much everybody who was there. And again, we'll talk about that here in a second, but that's where John says the Martian, who's not really a Martian and not really there, is always saying cheerfully depressing stuff like that. A green, grinning, intrusive thought. And so John just says, I'm fine. Now, he's anything other than fine, right? The reality of what had happened in John's life, when we got all the way to issue number 6 of Absolute Martian Manhunter, is that the White Martian had essentially taken over the town by possessing virtually everybody. And so the town itself went completely insane. Now, the White Martian in the Absolute Universe is still without any measurable origin whatsoever. And for the most part, seems to be dead. But one of the cool things is that with issue number 6 and the way it ended, it's actually not necessarily true. And we'll kind of roll that back in here in a second. But the other thing is that the White Martian in the Absolute Universe is an enemy of the Martian Manhunter, as you would expect from the main DC universe if you're familiar with that mythos. But as they kind of continue on, John says, I drive by my house, or what used to be my house. It's on the way. And that's when the Martian says opposite direction. And John says, well, almost on the way. And he says, they'll be eating breakfast right now. I wonder what they're having. I wonder how they're doing. I wonder how I got here, right? This place in his life. And that's where you kind of switch to Bridget, right? She says, I'm okay, Mom. Yes, of course, I miss him, but even when he was here, he wasn't really here, you know? I'm used to being on my own. And she says, it's Tyler I'm worried about. I think he's taking it really hard. Nothing like that. It's just, he's just different. different. Now, that's the important thing, because at the end of issue number 6, we saw the White Martian had possessed Tyler. We don't really know what the intention of the White Martian is, and this is about the extent of what we get with that little bit of a story arc being carried over. But the conversation that Bridget has with her mom begins to fill in the gaps of what had gone on here, which is that somewhere in this time period following issue number 6, they split. Now, of course, the way issue number 6 ended, it seemed like they were reconciling, right? Literally, he tells Bridget, no more secrets, which was kind of the big issue that John had, that he was so hyper-focused on his job, he neglected his wife and son. And so it drove this great big huge rift between the two of them. And so what ends up happening is you switch over to the FBI, where John now works. And this woman says, Agent Jones, right? First day back. And he says, supposedly, right? Did we remodel? And he says, the office looks completely different. And she just says, right? Everything is just the way you left it. We haven't changed a thing, because it's the federal government, right? They're incredibly slow to change for the most part. But that's where John gets to the office of his superior, right? And the superior says, your 3-month leave of absence is over, Jones. So he's been out, right? 3 months have passed since issues 6 and 7. But that's where he says, you have been cleared of all charges regarding that night. And that's where John says, no one likes to talk about that night. It's buried with all the other things that we cannot face. Now, what makes that night so incredibly important? Well, in addition to everything that had happened with the White Martian possessing everybody and people being driven to their most violent instincts, there's actually another event that had transpired that John is going to hit on here, which was for the most part tapped into over the course of issue number 6, but it was relatively easy to forget if you haven't read or followed up with the original Martian Manhunter run prior to this one coming out. So again, we'll kind of fill in those gaps. But that's where John's told, right? This is ridiculous. We found a pile of bodies at his house. But again, this guy chimes in and says the investigation cleared him of any wrongdoing. He took arms in self-defense. Isn't that right, John? And John just says, yes. And so the statement's made. Case closed then. But Jones, between your reputation in Washington and your erratic behavior here, you will be riding a desk for the foreseeable future. I am giving you another chance. Do not screw it up. And so that's where you find that John Jones' life has really taken a turn for the worst in a lot of different ways, right? Not only has he lost his family, but he doesn't even have the opportunity to be like out in the street doing police work. Instead, he's told, there's a stack of overdue paperwork at your station, kindly donated by your colleagues, in addition to your own. So I suggest you get to work. He's been slapped on desk duty, so he's just pushing forms is really all he's doing. And that's when he says, it goes on forever, but work is about all I have left, so I do it. After 10 hours and no discernible progress, the pile seems to have grown. I swear that I see birds circling the upper levels, and so I call it a day. And that's what the Martian just says, right? Lost cause. Progress is impossible, not here, right? You're never going to get through all this paperwork, man. I love how Dennis Camp writes Martian Manhunter in like this almost kind of like broken English, difficult to understand way, because he doesn't necessarily know how to communicate with humanity the way that we would communicate with each other. But the point gets across nonetheless, and it's just really dark humor. And so that's where he's walking through the parking lot, right? And he's asked, leaving so soon, right? I still see a mountain of paperwork back there. And John just says, I don't want to push it on my first day. But again, he's told, there's something off about you, Jones, and I am making it my business to find out what? And that's where John starts talking to himself again, right? He says, the hate on his breath is sharp, like vinegar, overwhelming. There are notes of perceived professional slights and lifelong insecurities, but the overwhelming stench of Newell's best friend and partner of 20 years, the man I replaced, dying in his arms of a heart attack, of all things. Now, this is a really interesting perspective here, because when it talks about the idea of perceived professional slights, we as people do that, right? Someone somewhere did us wrong, and for some reason, we just cannot let it go. And so we just hold on to that anger for years and years and years and years, to the point that it becomes our self-definition, right? Negativity bias. But at the same time, lifelong insecurities, whatever form these insecurities may take. This is a man who hardly has his life together. And that's where he thinks the statement, you should be here, not him. Now, that's one of the things to keep in mind about Absolute Martian Manhunter, and it's one of the things that makes the comic so surreal and so incredible, because the art fits in perfect with it. John Jones quite literally sees the thoughts of people almost as words emanating from them. If a person's angry, he will see red. If they are happy, he'll see blue or something like that. But he'll see different colors for this wording based on their emotions, which is why he understands that Newell doesn't want John to be here, that instead he feels like John is replacing his partner, something that cannot be done. And that's why John says, no hard feelings. I know that you're just doing what you have to do. And the Martian Manhunter chimes in, right? Everybody does that, John. Everyone's doing what they have to do, right? It's almost like a platitude. I understand that you're angry and I get that you're just doing what you have to do. It doesn't mean anything to say that, because everybody's always doing that. But it's one of the statements that human beings make to other human beings, not because the statement itself has any significance whatsoever. It's a way to extend an olive branch and to essentially say, I understand why you are angry, and I'm trying to extend this olive branch to show you that I'm not heartless and that I don't care. It's the meaning behind the statement, not the platitude itself. And so that's why John kind of walks away and he says, in case I never said it before, I am sorry about Agent Ellis. From everything I've heard, he was a good man. And so at that point, John kind of continues on and he says, I can't believe how much Middleton's changed the last few months. The streets are mostly empty, and those who were out do not look each other in the eye. After their experience with Martian vision, a brief and intense euphoria flooded the city. To know and be known is a powerful thing, but after a while, the euphoria faded, gradually shading to shame. Their most painful memories, their secret urges were suddenly public knowledge. The memories have mostly faded. The mind can only hold so much, and the shame and fear have hung around like pollution. And he says, I get it. What's more scary than being seen? And that's where the Manhunter says, White Martian makes victory from defeat. Because one of the things to keep in mind about the nature of the White Martian within the Absolute Universe was sowing discord and chaos. It was an attempt to basically divide and split humanity up. And so even though the White Martian was ultimately defeated, the goal was still achieved. Why? Because humanity, at least in the town of Middleton, is worse off than it was before. Because while the White Martian's influence turned the townspeople against one another, on some level, it's a thing you can come back from, right? You can kind of say, look, I apologize, I wasn't in control of myself. Everybody has blood on their hands, so no one is without mistake, cause, or sin. But the idea is that with everyone knowing everyone's dirty secrets now, all the things they hid from each other, all the betrayals, the lies, the deceit, cheating couples, right? Different things like that. Everyone knows everything. And for us as human beings, we need that privacy, right? We need the ability to think those thoughts without anyone knowing that we're thinking those thoughts. And so that's where John talks about the White Martian, and he says the White Martian is dead. And the Martian Manhunter tells him, death equals a physical process. We Martians do not have death concept. Life-death do not apply. So effectively, they cannot die. And he says, White Martian cannot be completely killed, destroyed, refuted, can only be weakened, contained, transformed. Now, this is a really interesting concept because from there, John asks the question, what is it? And what are you? And that's what the Martian just tells him, I can't really explain. And John says, try. And so the Martian says, resistance is futile. Of course, quoting the Borg from Star Trek. I love Dennis Camp's humor. And in turn, the Martian Manhunter says, buckle up, partner. And he says, we'll try to make it simple for you. And so all we get are just kind of like these glimpses, right? These images, right? Visions to a degree, where it's just like an object flying through what seems to be the multiverse. And then just like bouncing off what are potentially these planes of existence, right? Hitting these different rocks and then ultimately splitting into multiple colors, and each one arriving in either a different part of the world or in different universes. Now, for the most part, the idea of different universes wouldn't necessarily make a whole lot of sense just because of the fact that within the DC multiverse right now, all we really have is the main DC universe and the Absolute universe. The multiverse still exists. It's just that everything besides these two realities are cut off from it. So by and large, this is just traveling through existence itself. But again, a lot of questions are not being answered here. We know that in Absolute Martian Manhunter Volume 1, that the Absolute Martian Manhunter encountered Darkseid. So he knows Darkseid exists and knows that Darkseid is, on some level, responsible for the creation of all of this. Now, we don't know how deep-rooted the Martian's knowledge is and how much he knows about Darkseid, but there are a lot of theories that are circulating around out here. For example, those black rocks where everything splits off, people are kind of making these arguments that, like, it's the Rock of Eternity. More so than that, the colors themselves match the colors of the traditional lantern cores and emotional spectrums in the main DC universe. And so it's entirely possible that what's actually happening here is that while Al Ewing is doing his own kind of mythos with the Green Lanterns that exist out here in the Absolute Universe, that what Dennis Camp is doing is modifying the emotional spectrum as we know it, and that's what the Martian Manhunter is. It's what the White Martian is, and any other Martians that may exist out there. But seemingly they just arrived on Earth, and the White Martian arrived here as well, and then started wreaking chaos and war across the entirety of Middleton. But again, it's ambiguous at best, which kind of fits in perfect with the nature of the story. There aren't any clear answers here, and so that's why John is just like, what the hell was that? And the Martian just says, should pay attention. In current state, understanding is impossible. White Martian escaped, survived, continues. Defeat is only temporary, in hiding. And so again, while John doesn't really seem to know it, White Martian is hiding out inside of Tyler. Now, as for the whole situation between himself and Bridget, this is where things get really interesting, because while Bridget is kind of out there, right, having a smoke, what she does is almost kind of fill in the gaps for us about what happened between the two of them. That with John being so incredibly distant, something that actually goes all the way back to before he met the Manhunter. So it's been a pattern of behavior for quite some time, that after issue number 6, he had told Bridget about the Absolute Martian Manhunter, right? He had told Bridget that he was effectively possessed by it, explained seemingly everything that was going on. And so where he made the promise to keep no secrets, once he started spilling the beans on what was going on, she thought he was insane. And that's why she says, Martian's in your head, right? You are sick, John. You are dangerous. You need help. And so in essence, she left him believing he was insane. But with that being said, guys, we're going to bring this video to an end. Again, Dennis Camp, Javier Rodriguez, it's so awesome to see these guys back, right? Martian Manhunter is incredible in the Absolute Universe. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, drop a like. Thank you all for watching, and I will catch you all later. Peace.